My name is Nadia. I'm a legal researcher. I am here with Professor Vanice Valle, who has a doctorate's degree on human rights, a postdoctorate's degree on public administration. She is a former visiting fellow at Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program and is a permanent professor at Universidade de Estácio de Sá, Rio de Janeiro's master's and doctorate's degree programs. And we're here to discuss her short series of videos on the Brazilian constitutional framework. Professor, can you elaborate on what we can expect from this short series?
Yes, surely. The idea of that short series is to take away the kind of a cloth of invisibility that we have here in Brazil, because as you know, we insist in writing and speaking Portuguese. But we have a very rich experience with our constitution that has already reached 30 years. It's a very complex constitution. It's kind of a good example of the Latin American constitutionalism. Therefore, I thought it would be helpful for the International Academy to hear a little bit about our experience here in Brazil. So this is why the series of videos.
I think we could start from the beginning. Can you give us a little bit of a background on what the political climate was when the Constitution was proclaimed?
Yeah, sure. You should take into account that Brazil was ending a period of a military dictatorship. In that dictatorship for about 30 years also. We were in transit to redemocratization. There was a lot of political negotiation going on about how the militaries will go away from power and things will happen. At some point, it was even thought that we do not need a new constitution because we had a constitution that was enacted in 1967. But the military dictatorship approved a constitutional amendment in 1969 that made deep interventions and modifications in the initial constitutional text. So at some point we decided that a new constitution would be necessary, and this was the political ambience in which everything started. We have a very controversial way to start that constitutional moment because the National Constitution Assembly was summoned through a constitutional amendment in 1985. At the time, this was very controversial because people think that this showed some kind of lack of legitimacy. We have other aspects that were already also debated. One of them was the fact that the Congress would have both functions. It would deal with the ordinary legislative process and also be the National Constitutional Assembly. So this was also controversial. And the last point of controversy was the fact that we had at the time some senators that were not elected but were appointed by the president. And this also brings the matter of legitimacy. But despite all that controversy, the amendment was approved and the constitutional process began in 1986, and it took almost 2 years to end. And our new constitution was enacted in 1988, October the 5th, 1988.
Can you talk a little bit about the actors involved in this process of creating a new constitution?
One thing that was very characteristic of the Brazilian National Constitutional Assembly was the fact that the political forces were very balanced. You cannot identify some kind of political forces that was prevailing. So you find very conservative ones and also very progressive representatives. Another element that was very relevant to the development of the process was the fact that we do not have an initial draft to work with. So the National Constitutional Assembly started from zero with all those different tendencies represented in the Congress.
And how did these competing forces, the conservatives and the progressives, manage to overcome their conflicting interests in the designing of the constitutional framework?
As a matter of fact, the solution is something that is not unknown outside the Brazilian frontiers. What they did was to find a minimal consensus in some points and include those clauses, those minimum consensus in constitution. Some things have a work around that strategy, what is called constitutional agreement without constitutional theories. Rosie Dixon and Tom Gisberg also with deciding not to decide. So this is kind of a strategy that is already found in other constitutional processes. So you have, for instance, the granting of the right to property, and you have the next constitutional clause would say that property should be exercised according to a social function. And what is that social function? This was transferred to ordinary legislative decision. So this was the strategy that the progressive forces used to obtain adherence from the conservative ones. And it worked because the conservatives, they think that, well, okay, you can put these things and we'll held things back during the ordinary legislative process. And this, in fact, somehow happened. At the first 10 years, our constitution, that part of the fundamental rights, this was not a concern. This was not very noticed. We were very worried with the settlement of a normal democracy with the elections, a regular electoral process. So the human rights clauses were there in Constitution, but it was not problematic. At the time when we feel that democracy was already somehow settled, established, then we remember that those clauses are there and that they are invested with immediate application. And this is when all the discussion and the judicialization related with those fundamental rights began.
And were there strategies clearly defined, or how did they go about creating this new text?
Yeah, at the time, there was a very clear strategy held by the progressive forces. There was the idea that they should set some sort of political agenda to be developed in the future. So they used three different approaches. The first one was to bring to Constitution a very wide range of human rights. The Brazilian Constitution has the traditional liberty rights, but also a huge list of socio-economic rights, third dimension rights, and this was due to that strategy of the progressive forces. The idea was that setting a political agenda, these rights would be developed through the ordinary legislative process. The second strategy was also to build some institutions oriented to control the power, control the exercise of power, and to promote that development of the human rights project, the transformational project. So if you had any sort of political blockage in the legislative process, these institutions would be able to push things and enforce the development political agenda. And the third strategy was the inclusion of a constitutional clause that grants immediate application to all those human rights brought to the Constitution. This was a strategy to overcome the idea that human rights brought to Constitution might be a simple promise, a wishful thought, something to be enforced if and when the political agents in power decide to do so. So we have these three strategies, and all of them prevail. So you have in the Brazilian Constitution a huge list of human rights. a very strong institutional framework in charge of enforcing that transformational project, and you have the immediate application clause. We have also another constitutional clause that embraces all new human rights that are created through international treaties or conventions, and in doctrine have already developed the idea that you can also find implicit human rights in the Brazilian Constitution. So it's a very different experience, a very peculiar experience, because you have a huge list of fundamental rights that should be managed at the same time, because all of them are provided with immediate application.
Has this strategy prevailed? Did it work? Is it functioning? How is the constitutional experience now in Brazil?
Well, we are reaching 30 years, as I've already mentioned. We are almost reaching 100 constitutional amendments, and this means something. The initial project was providing answer to a certain political framework, and things have modified through these decades, but still we have a constitution that it's settled in two pillars. Power architecture, the drawing of the political institution, and fundamental rights. The problem of the enforcement of fundamental rights in Brazil has become a very sensible situation due to that clause of immediate application, because they are competing between themselves, because you may have a claim to enforce privacy rights, but also you have a claim to enforce a right to housing, a right to an adequate natural environment.
As far as I understand, human rights and fundamental rights in the Brazilian Constitution is the subject of our next video. Is that correct?
Yes, we should have a special video to explain that very complex system, and this will be our next subject in the next video.
Very well, Professor. I'll see you then.
Thank you very much. Thank you.